Greetings to C3RF members and friends across Canada and indeed around the world, and a special welcome to the folks at Veterans for Freedom on their dedicated streaming channels to this video summary of the C3RF update for 7 June 2024. The title of this update is Shattered, and it posits that Canada's earnest efforts to distinguish itself on the world stage as a serious and positive force in its own right are being crushed. So it has come to pass, as more than a century of proving itself to be much more than a colonial backwater have been dashed by its embarrassing efforts to cheerlead a failed World Health Organization pandemic treaty and its affiliated international health regulations across the finish line. This, as any pretense of sovereignty were offered up to make way for the international agency to take charge in the face of a wide range of possible emergencies. Climate change emergencies that have the potential to impact health, and which ones don't, would have brought the new pandemic treaty to bear. Another COVID virus on the loose from yet another biolab? Again, we would find ourselves reliving lockdowns and less than safe and effective vaccines, just as the WHO told us to do the first time around. Our support of such measures was akin to asking to be recolonized. The dream of a Canada making its own way on the international scene and making the world a better place as it did so was not only noble, it was realistic. The country was well down the path of fulfilling Prime Minister Laurier's 1904 prediction that the 20th century belongs to Canada, starting with its outsized and independent contributions to the winning of World War I and II, and before moving on to its founding membership in both the United Nations and NATO, not to mention its designation as a G7 nation. Canada had become a middle power punching well above its weight class, and this success had been engineered by true patriots who believed fervently that Canada was more than capable of pursuing an independent path. One such patriot was O.D. Skelton, who, as Canada's first Deputy Foreign Minister over the time period 1925 to 41, pitched his considerable resources of energy and intellect into the argument of an independent Canada. The persistent, measured, and incrementalist work of O.D. Skelton would set Canada on a path to making its own decisions on the world stage. His contributions to the Imperial Conference of 1923, for example, went a long way to enabling the Statute of Westminster of 1931 that would clear the way for Canada and all other dominions to exercise these freedoms legally. He would establish external affairs offices abroad for the first time and purposely stock them with men of merit like L.B. Pearson, who would distinguish Canada with his Nobel Prize-winning interventions in the Suez Canal crisis of 1956. Under Skelton's watch, Canada was not to persist as a colony, always looking elsewhere for direction. The national interest had to be calculated ruthlessly and rigorously, with Canada always coming first, even as it made the world a better place. Such hard-won influence, such freedom of action in support of the national interest, all potentially lost now as our ruling betters try desperately to prove their globalist chops by making Canada a vassal state of a new world order. The dream of an independent and influential Canada operating in its own interests as a first-order priority is not the only thing that would be shattered if our national leaders succeed in turning the nation into a vassal state. Lost as well would be the whole idea of freemen, operating within a legal context that saw the same law applying to all. This concept stretches all the way back to the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, when a nobility, sick and tired of arbitrary and biased royal rule, forced a reluctant king to agree that, quote, no freeman shall be taken, imprisoned, diseased, outlawed, banished, or in any way destroyed, nor will we proceed against or prosecute him except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, unquote. It also said, quote, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice, unquote. These understandings would burrow their way deep into the psyche of Western societies where Judeo-Christian values stood ready to reinforce and amplify such notions. It would not be long before the whole idea of sacrosanct individual rights and freedoms would find an enthusiastic reception beyond the noble class to include the citizenry writ large. A citizenry which over time would fight to the death to secure them for future generations. This seat of generational liberty would be transported across the Atlantic to the Empire's North American colonies. In the New England instance, they would take root to inspire a revolutionary fervor that would yield an exceptional Constitution of the United States of America anchored solidly by "We the people." In British North America, the flame of freedom would burn cooler, but would flicker persistently nonetheless. Where Americans demanded no taxation without representation, British North Americans would be just as adamant about representation by population. Their fatigue with rule from afar through connected yes-men in the form of the Family Compact in Upper Canada and the Chateau Clique in French Lower Canada would burst into violence in the rebellions of 1837 and 38. The rebels would be unceremoniously crushed, but motherland authorities would put aside the approach used to deal with the American colonies and instead respond with the Durham Report of 1839. The report was critical to the development of democracy in a growing Canada and recommended the installation of a responsible government that saw an executive answering to an elected assembly of representatives. This concept of representative democracy, when coupled by the rule of law provisions of the Magna Carta, would become central to the makeup of Canada's evolving constitution. Unfortunately, such concepts would be shattered by the outsourcing of executive action to the unelected non-Canadians charged with enforcing the World Health Organization's pandemic treaty and associated regulations. If the rule of law and representative democracy lie at the heart of the Canadian Constitution, it could be said that the embedded Charter of Rights and Freedoms is its soul. The Charter was patriated to Canada, along with all other constitutional documents, in 1982 and entrenched in the Constitution Act of the same year. It is part and parcel of the supreme law of the land, which no other law may contravene in any way. The Charter, in its preamble, gives a tip of the hat to the rule of law as one of the founding principles of the nation. The fact that this principle speaks to a law that applies equally across the board with all individuals in receipt of identical treatment is indicative of the unique value that each life brings to a society of free men and women. This emphasis of the individual and his or her distinctive attachment to rights was further reinforced by the second foundational principle within the preamble, that of the supremacy of God. In one fell stroke, the individual was identified as a unique locus of divinity whose liberties were not the chattel property of any man-made government, but bestowed by a higher authority out of reach of the state. The Charter would go on to expand on the concept of freedom in its Section 2 by identifying some of them as fundamental. These freedoms, in the form of expression, religion, thought, belief, peaceful assembly, and association, have been cited by the Supreme Court of Canada, and I quote, as an independent right with independent content, essential to the development and maintenance of the vibrant civil society upon which our democracy rests. Unquote. It further stated that this court saw, quote, fundamental freedoms as sine qua non, the indispensable ingredient of the political tradition underlying the Charter, unquote. In other words, it's these fundamental rights that are the keystone upon which Canadian democracy depends and which Canadians demand and have fought for. These cornerstone rights, the ones that all others depend on for their own existence, have been abused and forgotten by those who should know better, but who insist on balancing them away against other derivative rights. So Supreme Court Justice Abella made clear when she declared that the court was the, quote, final adjudicator of which contested values in a society should triumph, unquote. In the case of the Wuhan virus measures imposed by our public health care agencies, our courts have acceded to this logic through the prioritization of expert advice over any requirement to demonstrably justify them. Now, with the WHO possibly taking over responsibility for such impositions and even determining when they need to apply, we can only stand by as our keystone rights are outsourced offshore and thereby shattered. Goodbye to those transcendent liberties that neither state nor man could abrogate, and hello to being herded by globalist shepherds. In closing, a reminder to join us at our webpage at canadiancitizens.org, where you can see this update in its full glory, including all the links to all of the cited documents. Simply go to the News tab at the top of the page and select C3RF Member Updates from its drop-down menu. Until next time, this is Russ Cooper signing off, wishing you and yours much happiness and freedom from C3RF.